right, so we're going to have a little bit of fun. So I want you to find a partner. So just turn to somebody who's at your table. Turn to your right or your left. Pick a partner. If you're married, you might want to go to your spouse. That's probably a good thing. All right, so face your partner. And what you're going to do is you're each going to face each other and stick out your right hand with your thumb up, just like this. Right? Now what you're going to do is you're going to clasp the other 4 fingers together with your thumb up in the air. Right? Clasp hands, just like this. Right. On the count of 3, you got to try and get your partner's thumb down. 1, 2, 3. Some of us, it got us back, our athletic juices flowing. We didn't actually touch the field, and some of us, we haven't touched the field in a long time, so congratulations if you won. If you lost, you might want to train harder. It's really funny, we haven't done that for a very long time, most of us. And it's really interesting. It was a simple set of instructions, right? Get into a certain position, and then try and get your partner's thumb down. What did everybody in this room do? We started going against each other in thumb wrestling, right? And so, I think 2 things are happening, right? I just said try and get your partner's thumb down. The first thing that we go to, right, we fill in the gaps with the rules that we didn't hear with what we've done in the past, right? We go back to 1st grade and we start thumb wrestling against somebody. And it becomes a win-lose proposition. I've got to beat you. There's no way in God's green earth I'm going to let you beat me, right? When really it's a simple set of instructions. Try and get your partner's thumb down. And we could have done it a myriad of ways, but one of which could have been a win-win. We could have said, hey, I'll let you get my right thumb down with your hand if you let me get your left one down with my left hand. And it's just really interesting. I think 2 things are going on. What I see happening a lot in my life first, before anybody else's, but what I see with a lot of people is that we take the present and we look at the past and we say, here are the rules for living. This is how everything works, and then we expect the same in the future. The second thing that happened, some of us had a late start. I was watching, right? We looked around at what everybody else was doing before we started, and we were like, oh good, everybody's thumb wrestling, I can do that, right? And we got at it, right? And so a lot of us are operating out of a confirmation bias. We see what's going on just around us, and that kind of confirms that we should do a very similar thing. I know that for every single one of us, for everybody on this earth, there's a gap, okay? There's a gap between where we are and where we want to be, and there's also this gap between who we are and who we want to become. And whether or not we can all verbalize it, we do have a strategy for how we're closing that gap. And my question is always, and I'm glad somebody asked me this in my life, Jamie, how is that strategy working out for you? The strategy that I'm going to encourage you today is a strategy in theft, okay? Tonight's topic is, let's steal like artists. Now, it's really interesting. When I work with people in sports or in business, or even if I work with people in families, and even for myself, I never really understood it when I was playing. I'm starting to understand it now, but there's a big difference between comparing and competing. Okay? There's a tagline that goes around that comparison is the thief of all joy. And what's really interesting in sport, as in business, and with siblings, I have an older brother and younger sister. We look at what other people are doing and we start to compare ourselves to them. Now, the difference between comparing and competing are light years apart. Comparing is about being better than, and competing is about getting better. And so, I'll never forget one day, my business partner, he's my best friend, best man at my wedding, the guy that is the only guy who can ruffle my feathers the way he does. We're out training in Denver, and we're both trying to get into golf. We played golf for a little while, but we're actually getting top-class instruction from a guy who trained a bunch of pros on the PGA Tour. And I'll never forget it. We're working on the range, and for some reason, I started to excel a little bit faster than him. And for those of us who don't play golf, like, it feels really good the first time you let the club head release and you take a divot. That is a magical feeling. It terrifies the life out of me, but it's awesome. And this guy, Craig, who is teaching us, he's talking to Joshua, and he's got his hand on his head, and Joshua's looking down at the ball, and Craig says to him, he he says, hey, Joshua, how are you feeling about this? He's like, I'd be doing a lot bleeping better if Jamie would stop taking divots over there. And it was really interesting because that was the whole thing that was going on in our life the whole time. It wasn't about getting better. It was actually about looking better than someone else. And so there's a big difference between comparison and competing. And so what happens a lot, and for those of you who aren't social media, Instagram is a social media outlet, and basically you take pictures and you talk about them. And what happens for a lot of us is we get into this Instagram thing with our lives, where we don't want to let people see the imperfection and the struggle that we have. And so what do? We take a picture of the good times, and then we put a really nice filter on it, and we crop out all the bad spots, right? We go to the ends of the earth to try and make this picture perfect, and then it's post, and it feels good. When all of us who are sitting in this room know what each other, or we at least know what we look like when we wake up at 5 a.m. in the morning, we have our pajamas on. And for those of us who are married, it's got to be a strong marriage, right? And so we know some of the imperfections. But what happens is everywhere around us, we want to make things look good. And so we get into this place where, to be honest, we get into some sort of a prison where we're comparing to other people instead of trying to grow and get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. I've been blessed over the years to be able to work with some phenomenal people, from the 9-year-old kid that I get to train to play soccer in Denver to the guy that I get to walk around some of the nicest courses on the PGA Tour with. People in the NFL, Major League Baseball, people at C-level positions in big companies, people who are staying at home with their children. They're not just stay-at-homes, they're staying home with their children, one of the most important jobs we can do. And it's really interesting as I start to get involved with their life and I start to think about my life as well. The overwhelming message, the common theme, the common thread for all of us is that we all struggle. And it's really interesting that when I can start to unpack things with people and I can start to let them know that, hey, I don't have it all together. They're like, really? Yeah, I don't have it all together. And those people that you're emulating who are playing professional sport, when I start to talk with them, they feel like fakes and phonies and frauds. I was talking to a lady the other day who's in the top 20 in the money list on the LPGA Tour, and she said to me, when I go out there and I go and practice, I look around at everybody else and I'm wondering to myself, why is it so much easier for them? And I've also talked to other ladies on the LPGA who say the exact same thing about her. The guy that I get to train on tour, he tells me a story. He said he goes to an event, and he's sitting down with a guy named Jonathan Bird, and he's talking to him, and he's like, hey man, you're just awesome. He's like, I love watching you play. In fact, at my big screen at home, like I have a video of your swing. Yours is the swing that I try to model, and I draw all these lines, and I try and get in these positions. He's like, dude, if I had your swing, I'd be crushing it. Jonathan's like, you gotta be kidding me. He's like, I do the exact same with your swing. He's like, I look at the exact same thing, and I'm thinking to myself, man, if I had yours, I'd be crushing it. And the both of them just sat there, and they're like, aren't we a bunch of idiots? And so what's happening is we're getting into this battle where we're comparing our lives with other people, and it's really a value proposition. Because what happens, and I see this happening in my life before I see it happening in other people's lives, is that sometimes I'll look at what people do, and I'll equate that with who they are. And so I'll look at that and I'll talk to somebody who's making a lot of money doing something that they love, and I'll put them up here and I'll be like, man, how could I ever talk to them? And so I come into these meetings, I come into these conversations, and it's like I feel like I don't have any value to provide, and I just got to listen and just try and get and take and take and take. But I've also been on the other end of the spectrum, where I sit down with people and I know I'm a little bit older than them, and I know that I have some value to provide them. I can see them. They're holding my book. They want to talk to me, and sometimes that puts me in a position where I feel like, Jamie, you're up here, and they need to sit down, shut up, and listen. And so what I try really hard with is really trying to start to see people according to who they really are. And if there's one line that you can take away from tonight, it's probably the most important thing that I do with anybody, and I do myself, is that our worth doesn't come from what we do. It comes from who we are. I played soccer at Vanderbilt University. Soccer was my life. I grew up here in Broken Arrow. I was talking to the guy who serves the athletic director at Broken Arrow, and he was like, hey, did you lose a game in high school? I said, yeah, I lost 2. We were the #1 team, high school team in the country for 3 years. My soccer team went on and won state, won regionals. We were one of the top 4 teams in the country. In terms of results, we definitely weren't one of the best 4 teams in the country. And then I went on to Vanderbilt, and soccer was my life, and that's how everybody knew me until it came to one point. After my junior season, they called us into the locker room, and our coach told us, he said, guys, listen, they cut the program. He said, they're adding women's swimming and women's bowling. Okay? Now, I have nothing against women, and I have nothing against bowling, all right? But that was a hard thing for me to take. Because what had just happened in my life, my identity was so wrapped up in what I did, that when somebody said, hey, we can take this away from you, my world was shattered. And the hardest, the biggest thing that I do with people, and I work on myself, is trying to help people understand that they matter, and that their worth comes from who they are and not what they do. And when we know that our worth comes from who we are and not what we do, we can move from comparing to actually competing. So there's a great little book that's been written. It's called Steal Like an Artist. For those of you who don't like reading, this is a picture book, and it's fantastic. And this guy, yeah, some of you guys are like, great, I can do that, right? Congratulations, RSU. This book, Steal Like an Artist, is fantastic because this guy, Austin Kleon, he's a real creative guy, and he finally got sick of people saying, you know what, things got to be original. We're really looking for original talent. And so what he did was he started to scour information and talk to people who operated at a very high level in what they did, whether it was business, sport, music, drawing, whatever it was. And the consensus all is that nobody's original. No one. And when it comes down to it, what really happens is we look at people that we really admire and what they do, and we start to copy them. And we copy them more until we become this unique representation of them. I've got this girl who I love. I've been training with her for probably 9 months. Her name's Michelle Betos, and she plays goalkeeper position. And she's now playing for the Portland Thorns. She's playing professionally. She's living her dream right now. And back up, she went to college. She did really well, and her first team that she went to was in New York. And she was really excited, but then New York signed the #1 goalkeeper at the time, Hope Solo. Hope Solo was the goalkeeper for the U.S. national team, and so Michelle was just kind of like, how's this going to work? And so she slogged it out for about a year and a half, and then Portland decided, hey, we'll sign you. And she's like, great, finally, I put in my time, now I'm going to step into that role and be the #1. Well, just after they signed her, they decided to sign the lady who starts for the German national team, who, by the way, is voted as the #1 goalkeeper in the world and was voted as the #1 player in the world. Good luck, Michelle. Right? It was around this time when we started working together, and she has a ridiculous work ethic. She has an amazing heart. People all the time on the bench will say, like, you affect the game, or people on the field will say that you affect the game even without playing. That's how awesome she is. And we were talking about this, and she was like, it feels like a really bad beat. It feels like I did all this work, and now it should be my time, but it feels like I'm being stepped on again. And so we have this line that we talk to people with all the time, and we talk to them about believing that it's in their best interest. Not trying to figure out how is this in your best interest, but when something like that comes along and you start to believe that it's in your best interest, you start to put one foot in front of the other instead of collapsing and falling apart. And so Michelle started to do this, and she's like, I don't really know how to do this. I mean, I guess Nadine could get injured, and then maybe I have an opportunity. And I said, yeah, great. Let's make sure we're training and we're staying on top of things. But I said, can I just tell you about this book, Steal Like an Artist? And I said, the thing that I would really encourage you in is you got to understand that you had one of the most valuable internships of anybody on the planet in soccer. You got to study behind Hope Solo. And I asked her, and this is nothing against Hope, but I asked her, I said, is Hope just perfect? She's like, no, let me tell you. I was like, yeah, but she does some things really well, doesn't she? She's like, yeah. I said, all right, let's talk about those. What are the things she does well? But what are the things that she doesn't do too well? And I said, now you're studying under this girl Nadine, and if she's really this good, then there must be something that she is doing that's fantastic. I said, what is that? And she started to tell me, and I said, well, where are the things that she's fallen deficient and that aren't as good as they could be? And she said, these are them. I said, now let's talk about what you bring to the table. What is uniquely you? And it was really interesting because as we started to put all these three things together, we started to create this like superhuman Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle goalkeeper, right? And we decided like this is how we're going to start to train. So she does all this training in the dark. During the off season, it wasn't an off season to her. It's this sounds stupid, but it was the op season, the OPP, the opportunity, the season for opportunity. And so she passed on a lot of things she could do, hanging out with her family and being around friends, and went overseas to a country she couldn't understand anybody. And she was sticking at trying to combine these three things, trying to steal like an artist. Just recently, the Women's Soccer League just started, and I got a text from one of our mutual friends, and she showed me the lineup, and it said first game of the season, Michelle Betos, starting 11. And I talked to her after the game, and she called me a couple days later, and I talked to her, and I said, hey, it was really cool you took the spot, and I was wondering, maybe Nadine was hurt, maybe something happened. She goes, you won't believe this. She said, I come into preseason, and the coaches are just blown away, and the coach comes to her, and they're like, he just says to her, he's like, Michelle, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but how did you get this good? He's like, I've talked to everyone in the club. We're paying her more money, and everybody in the club is saying that you deserve the starting spot. She hasn't done anything wrong, but you have taken it from her. You're our number one. She starts the game. And so what happens for a lot of us is we start comparing. We say, listen, I'm not where I want to be right now, but that person's where I want to be. And what happens for most of us is we say, well, if I had their resources, if I had their swing, if I had their height, if I had their skill, if I had their opportunities, well, then things might be different. Instead of coming back and saying, what do I have in my hands, and how can I be ridiculously faithful in stewarding that? It's interesting. You go down the list. There's a guy, Ray Lamontagne. He's a singer, and he plays guitar. And the first time I ever heard this guy, Ray Lamontagne, I'm a big Etta James and Ray Charles fan. And I heard this guy, and I was like, ooh, he's like a buttery little Ray Charles. I was like, man, that's kind of nice. And my perception was, this dude just popped out the womb, and he just started singing Ray, right? There's a book called The Talent Code, and it talks about his process and what he did. And when he was 22, he worked in a shoe factory. And he had played guitar, but he really wanted to sing. And so what he did was he basically locked himself into his apartment for about 2 years and just started playing Al Green, Etta James, Otis Redding, Ray Charles. Played them over and over again, playing Ray Charles songs with Etta James' voice and vice versa. Just trying to figure it all out. What makes them them? And after 8 years of grinding on this, he sold his first record, sold over 1 million copies. You know why it sold over 1 million copies? Because people heard him on the radio and thought it was Ray Charles. Another guy, Edelman, who plays for the New England Patriots. He's a wide receiver. He plays wide receiver, and when Wes Welker was with the New England Patriots, and now he's a Bronco, thank goodness, but when he was with the Patriots, Wes Welker was killing it, and nobody knew about this guy, Edelman. He was in the background. Nobody knew him. He wasn't going to play. Wes is on his way to a Hall of Fame career. And this guy, Edelman, became a shadow. I'm not just talking about he looked at him from afar. Like literally, he was standing in his shadow. He was watching how he ate, what he ate, when he rested. He was watching how he did recovery runs, how he ran his routes, how he was intently looking at the coaches, how he was interacting with the quarterbacks. And it got to a point where Wes Welker actually says he had to ask him to please step off because you're annoying the crap out of me. But what's really interesting is when Wes moved on to the Denver Broncos, Edelman stepped up and he started to kill it. And people to this day will say he looks so much like him. Von Miller, a very similar story. He wins player of the game and he sits down with the panel on Monday Night Football and they say, you look like this guy Frederick Thomas. He said, I know. He said, when I was at Texas A&M, I watched a 10-minute video every night of Frederick Thomas. Is it any wonder? None of us are originals. That shouldn't put us down. That should get us excited. It's not what we do that matters. It's really about who we become. I was actually talking to someone earlier today, and I said, I asked myself this question recently. I heard it come to me, and it was, Jamie, if you got $1 million, and he filled in the blank, he was like, oh, what would you do? I was like, no, see, that's where I was going wrong for a very long time. It was, Jamie, if you're going to have $1 million, who are you going to become? And that's a much better question. Because if you're someone who's really invested in growth, when you get $1 million, your first thought will not be, I only have $1 million. Your first thought is going to turn to, how can I share this? Or how can I make this into 10? Because you're changing who you become. And it's really interesting when I get to work with people, I hear people all the time saying, Jamie, I got these crazy goals, I want to do this is where I want to be, I want to work in this job, and I'm like, great, who do you want to become? They're like, well, I told you, I want to work this job, I want to be the CEO, I want to be a professional player. I'm like, no, I didn't ask what you wanted to do. Who do you want to become? Like, personal characteristics. What is the type of person that you want to become? I asked the lady I was talking to who coaches Division I women's golf, and she has a 6-month-old son and I think a 3-year-old daughter. And she was talking about, she's like, Jamie, I don't really know if your stuff is the right stuff for us. And I said, that's fine, I don't mind that. But let me ask you one question. I said, did your time when you were playing Division I golf and when you played on tour, did that actually prepare you for becoming a mother? She's like, no. She's like, it was fun, but listen, for those of us who have children, we know there's long nights. You've got this little 1-year-old and you want to talk about not feeling like you're qualified. You get a child and you take them home from the hospital. You're like, don't I have to have a license for this? No. What do? I have no idea. Nobody has it all together. And I said to her, you know, listen, those nights when you've got this 1-year-old who's crying in your arms and they can't communicate, you're tired, you've got your job on the line, you've got people who are depending on you and your organization. Your husband's coming home late, you don't feel great, but yet you've still got to be excellent, you've got to communicate, you've got to do what's in everybody's best interest. How are we training that in our sport? How are we training that in our school? How are we training that in our job? And sadly what I see is that in a big way, a lot of people are being used by their sport instead of using their sport to become the people that they want to be. Because sport's going to run its course. We ask everybody that we work with to do one simple exercise, to write out their obituary, that little thing that we want said about us when we pass away. And not once, regardless of demographic, regardless of country, regardless of age, does it come back, I want a state title, I want a conference championship, I had this money in the bank, this is where I live. It always comes back to 2 things. The characteristics that we have as a person and the influence that we have on other people. And so when we start to put those first things first, things start to change. And so it all comes down to this book. If I could give you one tool that you guys should definitely check out, there's a book that's called Mindset. And it's written by a lady named Carol Dweck. And all her research shows that most of what we do, our characteristics, are actually trained. So if you go into a first grade classroom and you ask this classroom, how many people in here are artists? How many hands do you think you have going up? Every single one. And they're raising like 2 hands because somehow we thought that like gave us more credit, right? Me. You go into that same classroom 2 years later, 3rd grade, and you have between 2 and 4 hands. Now, I get it. Some of us, we do our artwork and we bring it home and our parents have our neighbor's artwork on the refrigerator, all right? That's not helpful. That doesn't help in the process. I grew up with a guy named Mitch Helberry, and he was phenomenal at art. And I remember one time he showed me this thing that he did where he drew like a Lamborghini Diablo, but he drew it with dots. 1,000 dots. I'm in 5th grade, I don't have time for 1,000 dots. And here I am trying to draw this car, and it looks something like something out of the Jetsons. It's got a wheel that you can't tell if it's a circle or a square. It's really a squircle. I'm like, there's no way I can match with this kid. And what happens for a lot of us is we do things to the point where it gets hard and it doesn't look as good as everybody else, and then we stop. I've got a young kid that I train. He's a 9-year-old. He plays soccer, and I'm working with him one day, and I'm pumping balls into his right foot, which is dominant foot, and he's just turning, he's stroking a ball into a net. Things are great, and I said, all right, let's start to use our left foot. He's like, man. I'm like, here we go. I was like, what's going on? He's like, man, my left foot's crap. I'm like, right. Like, so, listen, if you believe that your left foot is crap, what aren't you going to do? I guess I'm not going to practice. It's like, okay. And if you don't practice with your left foot, what are you going to start to believe about it? That it's crap. And he's 9 years old, so I had to take him further. We had to do this like 3 or 4 times. But we start to sow these beliefs and reinforce the beliefs in things that we are good at or not good at, and then we call them God-given talents. When really, if we started to put work in, we can start to change. I tell people all the time, one of the reasons I'm not good at math is because I went to the back of the book. I got the even answers and guessed at the odd, right? I'm not saying I could have solved all the world's problems with mathematical equations, but I could have been good enough to be able to not rely on my iPhone to add 7 plus 8, right? And so I'm really interested for all of us here. We're all going somewhere tomorrow. For some of these people who are playing athletics, listen, this may be your last go around, and maybe you're stepping into an internship or into a new company. For some of us, we're going to return to Rogers State in another year. It's going to be another year of athletics. For some of us, we're going to our business tomorrow. And the question becomes, how are we using our context, whether that's at home, whether that's in school, whether that's in sport, or whether that's in business, to become the type of people that we want to become? How do we even do that? So I've got this guy that I work with. He's 37. He started his own law firm in Denver. And he started his law firm because he wanted a challenge, which is amazing. And the law firm's just thriving and everything, but he's still feeling unfulfilled. And so we started to talk, and I said, you know, Thomas, let me ask you, who do you want to become? He's like, what? I said, okay, let's do this. Who are some people that you really admire? Like, you love being around them. How would you describe them, and what are some characteristics that you love about them? He's like, oh. And so he starts to think about it, and he started telling me about a guy who he had just befriended, who he has this presence about him. When you go in and you sit down with this guy, it feels like all judgment in the world, from everything you have done wrong or haven't done right, it just goes out the window, and he treats you with unconditional love. He's like, I want that. He tells me about another friend who doesn't get rattled when people get upset on the phone or on the stand. And he's able to diffuse hostile information or situations. I want that. I was like, great, here's what we do. Every single day, we're going to be focusing on one of these characteristics. All right? First thing that we're going to do is we're going to start to become very intentional about when you start to judge other people. Who are the people that you tend to judge? And he said it. The guys who come in and who seem like they have all the money, or they went to these illustrious colleges, because I didn't go to this illustrious college, I put them on this pedestal. I'm like, great, you know you're going to interact with those people tomorrow. Now we know. And when we can start to become aware of the context, where we feel like we get in judgment, and where we feel like our worth and our value comes from what we do, then we can start to be very intentional. And it's been amazing to watch this guy go from being absolutely timid and being just really strong and looking like he wants to punch your head off, to coming in and being in your presence and genuinely caring. We actually train the characteristics that we have. And we do that with a growth mindset. People always ask me, like, Jamie, so how did you get into public speaking? And I always tell them, well, I started by selling fruits and vegetables. When I went out to Ireland, I went to go play ball. It sounds really good in that little write-up that they said, you know, Ballymun United is not a professional team. And when I went out there to go play for a professional team at the Shelburne Football Club, and I arrived in Ireland, I was like, hey, my name's Jamie. And they're like, what? And I was like, I'm the American. And they're like, oh, we didn't know you were coming. We thought that was a joke. I'm like, well, it's not. And it's not funny. So we do something about this. And I had to really hustle. I found out my wife had a friend who was living overseas in Dublin, and she actually allowed me to stay on her dorm room floor with 3 other girls in her dorm room for the first 4 months. Yeah, it sounds great, but that's not what happened, right? And so I started to try and figure things out. I went from club to club feeling like I was being rejected all the time, and I started to realize at that point, Jamie, if soccer is the source of your joy and sorrow, you're going to ride this emotional roller coaster the rest of your life. And so every day started to become, I'm trying to get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. I finally find a team that's going to take me on. I finally go down and sit down and sign a contract, and then the government says, Jamie, you can't get a work permit. They're not going to pay you enough. Man, I really want to be here. I really want to be here. What can I do? A friend of mine, she found out that there's this guy who sells fruits, organic fruits and vegetables at these markets around Dublin, and I was like, great, maybe I can go talk to this guy. Jamie, what do you know about fruits and vegetables? I don't have a clue. It doesn't really matter. It's a job. Maybe I can get paid. And sure enough, he hires me. And it was during that time when I was selling fruits and vegetables on the side of the road that my character and my ability to be able to speak and connect with people really started to happen. My organization, you couldn't even call it an organization. They would bring these stuff in these big trucks from the farms to the city, and they drive for an hour and a half, and then they'd open up this truck, and you had no idea what was going to happen. There could be a farm cat that jumped out at you. There could be someone from Poland who was like trying to just live at their farm who jumps out at you. You had no idea what was going to happen. And one day, I'm new to this, and they're like, Jamie, do you want to? We opened up this other market today. Why don't you go and run it? Okay, figure this out. And they habitually did not give us the tools that we needed to do our job. To sell fruits and vegetables, at least the way that they do it in those markets, you're supposed to weigh them. You're supposed to have a measure, a scale. They give me a scale that does not work. How do you sell fruits and vegetables and be fair on both sides? It comes down to really one thing. I remember this lady, she was an elderly lady, and she used to always come to our stand, and she was always upset. She always had something that she could point out and just drag on about, right? And so she shows up one day, and it's lashing rain outside. It's freezing cold. It's not a nice day. I didn't really want to be there. And she comes up to the stand, and every one of my coworkers is like, oh, here she is again. And I had known from something that my mom instilled in me that a lot of times in life, things are less about me and more about other people. And I saw all these opportunities in the market as opportunities that were going to grow my character. And so when this lady showed up one day, I was the first to pop out to her, and I said, hey, it's great to see you today. And she's like, well, isn't the weather terrible? And that's how we start every conversation in Ireland. The weather's horrible. Yes, it is. Get over it. And so she starts going at me, and she's like, well, your lettuce doesn't look really fresh. Your cucumbers are soggy. Like, I don't like the green that's on those apples. I'm like, sorry, they're green apples. And she comes to this one issue. She says, why aren't your pineapples from Ireland? And so at that point, I had two different decisions. I can either be like, you know what, this is the end of the road. Of course they're not from Ireland. We get 300 days of rain. Pineapples need at least 300 days of sunshine. No chance. But I knew it wasn't really about how I felt. It was more about the character that I was becoming. And so I just said to her, listen, I know it's sad that they're not from Ireland. And really, we don't have the climate. As you can see, the things out here, these things just won't grow. And I love pineapple upside down cake just as much as you do. And if we're going to have that, then we got to have pineapples. These are organic. This is the country that it's from. Here's all the background on them. You can have one. She's like, oh, okay, thank you. And people again ask me how I got into doing what I do, and I say I never dreamed of doing any of this. I love doing it. I never dreamed of doing this. But what I've seen again and again in my life is that when you start to really work on your character, it's funny how opportunities start to show up knocking on your door. There are people out across the country right now who we are intentionally training, and we're watching from afar. And when they graduate college and they get a couple years down the road in their business, they might be the one or two people that we're going to ask to step into our company. Because it's about character. And our character is malleable, and it's something that we change, or it's something that we train. It really comes down to awareness and intentionality. The most important thing about this summer for everyone in this room isn't necessarily about what you do, the internship that you go to, or what everybody else is doing. It's not really about the job that you're going to that's going to take you to the next level. Every single one of us has an opportunity every single day to train our character. And as our character grows, all bets are off. I want to tell you this story about a guy named John. John was a builder by trade. And he worked over in the UK, and over the course of 20 years, he became the premier housing developer in the whole of the UK. And if you wanted a nice house built, you talked to John. John delivered on time, actually ahead of schedule. Everything was as beautiful as you could have thought, but he always brought this wow factor. He was able to think about what you were saying and then make something that you couldn't even express. And so John starts to get a little bit older, and he says, hey, I want to retire. I got grandkids. I want to play golf, pina coladas, beach. That's me. And so he goes into his boss's office one day, and he says to his boss, he says, hey guys, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to work here, but I'm done. This is the last build. And his boss says, hey, thank you so much. This place would not be the same without you. We built this off your back. Thank you. And so he turns around, and John is walking out the office, and his boss says to him, he says, hey, John. John turns back around, and he says, hey, listen, I got one last build. It's a name that came up on the docket, top-class client, love this person. Can can you do it? You're the only person for the job. Through gritted teeth, John's like, okay. Now, this build in the UK can take anywhere from 6 months to maybe 3 years, depending on the weather and the shape of the build. And he knows that. And one of the reasons John was so great at what he did was because his process was meticulous. He was the first in, the last out. He knew everybody's job down to the slightest little detail. He went out and bought all the fixtures himself. And he was excellent with the people who were actually building the house. He would talk to them about their family. He would care about them. He'd give them extra time off. He would bring them food. He would bring them on an umbrella on a really rainy day. And so John gets into this build, the usual process. But over the course of 6 months, he's got this one eye out there saying, gosh, I would really love to go play golf. I would really love to be on the beach. Grandkids, pina coladas. And so his process starts to move a little bit down. He's not the first guy in or last guy out. He's not going over all the plans. He's not buying the fixtures and the fittings. He's not pouring into his staff. And so this house gets done. It gets done on time, and it's built. It's up to code, but it's missing that wow factor. It doesn't have that wow factor that John was accustomed to having. And so he walks into his boss's office, and he says, listen, I'm done. That last one was a slog. It was so hard. I'm done. No more. And his boss says, thank you. Listen, you have no idea how much that means to us. Thank you so much. So John starts to walk out, and his boss says to him, hey, John. John's like, oh, no. And he turns around, and he's holding a little white box. He says, this is for you. And so he takes the bow off the box, he opens the box, and pulls out a set of keys. And his boss says to him, the house is yours, you deserve it. And immediately John's heart sinks. Why? Because he knew if he was building his own house, he would have done things a lot differently. And I didn't know it the first 25 years of my life, but I was largely building my own house. Each one of us, we are the people, flesh and blood on this earth, who have the most say about us. And the work that we put in the dark and in the off-season, day in and day out, and things that never show up on the stat sheet, are never announced from a podium like this, are the things that actually drive results. I'm not talking about scores, I'm not talking about money, I'm talking about legacy for your family. When we put first things first, the second things won't be suppressed. The money, the jobs, the opportunities, those will be there in abundance. But we've got to start first with what's controllable, and that's our character. I want you to know this. No one has it all together. No one is original. Nobody's perfect. We all struggle. And everyone has the same value. We're all on the same level. Our worth comes from who we are, not what we do. Everyone's important. Everyone matters. And everything we do matters. Everyone's stealing. So my call to you is, why not steal like artists? So thank you guys so much for your time.